Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, and today probably the most important day ever, because today is the final day of Zelensky's, president term. Tomorrow he's going to be nobody. Of course, he found a tricky way how to extend his presidential terms by adopting additional martial law and something like this. Okay, even if we take this situation, we remember that the last time Zelensky extended the martial law to this event took place in the beginning of May, and in the beginning of May he had a legal power to do this, right? And usually he extends the martial law for another 90 days. So that means that the next time in August, when this martial, let's say, period of time will be finished, Zelensky of course will be forced to extend martial law once again, and the next time he's going to do this having no legal power to do this. So this is the current situation. Of course, everybody was waiting for this day, not because, let's say, we were expecting that something is going to change or something like this. Of course not. It was very interesting to see the reaction of Russia. We understand the reaction of the Western countries, because the Western countries regarding the situation with Zelensky will support him, will give him whatever he likes and many other things. We are expecting the reaction of Moscow, what the Russians are going to do with Zelensky president term and his legal power, and what are they going to do, whether they're going to recognize him as nobody or they will continue calling him Ukrainian President Zelensky. Nobody knows for sure, but the only thing we know for sure is that the Russians have already concentrated significant number of strategical aviation, like 12 Tu-95s, 30 Tu-22, 1 Tu-160 and 2 AN-12. So according to experts, the Russians concentrated significant number of air forces, and of course everybody understands that most likely the Russians are going to, read in quotes, celebrate Zelensky and the president term by massive missile strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine. And furthermore, right before I start making the video, the sources reported that the Ukrainians launched a massive, missile alarm all over the entire territory of Ukraine, because they stated that the Russians raised 6 MiG-39 with Kinzhal missiles. We understand what kind of purposes, why the Russians can use Kinzhal missiles, because once again Zelensky tomorrow is no longer a president, and he becoming a valid target for the Russians. And the only way how to get Zelensky for Russians, of course, to use like missiles like Kinzhal hypersonic that can penetrate any defense belt and any bunker or any stronghold of Ukraine. So once again, we don't care, everybody don't care probably how the Western countries are going to react on Zelensky and the presidential terms. Everybody is interested what are the next steps of the Russian Federation. Now let's move to the line of combat contact. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and let's say the most important probably update we received today from Siversk direction. And today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation stated that as a result of clashes, the units of the EU group of forces completely established complete control over Bilohorivka from Lugansk People Republic and took more advantageous lines and positions. So this is Bilohorivka, this is bloody and crazy Bilohorivka. Probably the Russians made hundreds of attempts to attack this village, but most of them were repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians suffered significant losses during the previous days and during the previous waves of attacks. And today, on the 20th of May, the Russians captured the village, and the Russians managed to answer the hills around Bilohorivka. Currently, we don't know the real status of the landfill and this territory, but most likely the Russians captured this landfill as well, and this industrial zone. And most likely the Russians managed to move, according to the Ministry of Defense, to more advantageous positions. But anyway, for now we have what we have. We need more details, some geolocation, some videos, and as soon as anybody publish them, we will adjust the map, let's say, more accurately. For now we have what we have. Anyway, because of the fact that the Russians captured Bilohorivka, we can say that today, the 20th of May, is the first official date, of the beginning for the battle for Siversk, because Bilohorivka was the only problem why the Russians couldn't, let's say, advance further to Siversk from other directions, because without Bilohorivka, without cutting the Ukrainians, let's say, from Serebryanka, from Siversk, the Russians had no chances to complete this mission successful. Furthermore, as far as possible, as far as the Russians are able to move further to the west, the more and more problems the Ukrainians in Kremenaya forest will suffer. And I'll remind you just for some statistics, if you remember, after the end of the battle for Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, the edge Russian positions took place somewhere here. So they managed to answer Grigorovka already, let's say almost a year and a half ago. But after the Ukraine counterattack, the Russians were forced to fall back, and the Russians spent up to 1 year and 6 months to return control over this small but very, very bloody village by the name of Bilohorivka. The battle has ended. Now the Russians are moving further to Siversk. We have not just the updates about Bilohorivka when talking about Siversk. Very interesting video today we got from Sporny direction. On this video, for example, we can see another Russian convoy, very armored convoy with a few tanks, with probably 3 tanks and a significant number of personnel carriers. Were moving towards the village from the east to the western direction. We don't know for sure how exactly the battle ended, but in the final part we see that the Russians were entering the Sporny. This is it. Some Russian armored vehicles got on minefields and were destroyed. If we move back on map, the Russian tanks were moving something like this. So they're moving through the fields in this direction, and they entered Sporny in this area. We have adjusted the map. We are showing this territory as a gray zone. Most likely using that significant armored feast, the Russians captured the entire Sporny, but for now we don't have geolocations or proofs of that, but most likely this is exactly what happened. And it's not something that we can surprise us, because during April and May the Russians were very focused on the direction. We can just increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of May, and we can see the Russian focus in 5 directions. The first one, Bilohorivka, we see significant focus of artillery, of total tower systems, of multiple launch rocket systems, aviations, and that direction was broken through by the Russians, and the Russians managed to bypass. There is still, let's say, the territory in the vicinity of Verkhnekamianska is covered with the fog of war. We see significant number of geolocations. The Russians were trying to break through this direction, but for now we don't have any geolocations confirming this. Sporny, most likely the Russians captured the village. At least the video shows us that the Russians, using significant number of tanks and armored vehicles, entered the village, and after that we stopped receiving any updates. During the previous months, April and May, the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian force along the railways. We can't tell whether the Russians managed to break through this area, but we know for sure that Ukrainians suffered significant losses along the railways, and most likely the Russians finished the preparation of the foothold before further offensive operation along the railways as well. So if we summarize everything until by now, the Russians have a certain, let's say, directions of how they're planning to move further to Siversk along the railways through Sporny. The Russians are planning to attack through Verkhnekamianska. The Russians are planning to move through Bilohorivka further to Serebryanka, and of course the village by the name of Razdolovka. More and more sources are saying that the Russians managed to enter Razdolovka. The Russians managed to improve their positions towards more valuable positions. Many other reports, and now we see 5 directions that the Russians are planning to use to make the final and, let's say, vital strike in direction of the town by the name of Siversk. And 2 of the 3 directions most likely were already penetrated, broken through by the Russians, and which confirms that we can start counting days. Yes, probably we can start counting days before Siversk falls, and everything is logical. The Russians are moving. The Russians are about to finish the securing of the Russian flanks along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass river, and after that they will be able to turn a significant number of reserves to Siversk, because for now I don't think that the Russians are going to cross Canal. It's better for them to capture Siversk before even the battle for Chasiv Yar, but we're talking like this because we don't know the exact number of Russian reserves and forces they have. Let's say how many soldiers they have to continue. Maybe they have enough of soldiers either to continue in Chasiv Yar and Siversk as well. When talking about Chasiv Yar, as you can see, we have adjusted the map because we continue receiving more and more updates that currently there are very heavy clashes already inside of the eastern Chasiv Yar. On this video we can see another Russian vehicle that arrived in the area, landed infantry, probably maybe the Russians maybe made something like evacuation or rotation and were trying to evacuate from the territory, and they managed to do this. Anyway, this video confirms that most likely this building is already under Russian control. This is the building number 22. Yes, but we have some doubts about the Russian control over this block, because today we got another video how the Russian tank behind the garages, behind this area, were attacking these Ukrainian buildings with tanks. So this is the Russian tank tank. On this maybe angle it's not very easy to see, but the camera will turn a little bit. This is the tank, yes, and the very bottom of the screen we can see the tank. This is the tank who was heading to the eastern Chasiv Yar and was attacking and was destroying the building from a very short distance. According to sources, the Russians control everything, as you can see right now on map that colored with red color. The rest of Chasiv Yar either under Ukraine control or in the gray zone. And if you remember, yesterday we got videos how the Russians captured these buildings, but most likely the Ukrainians managed to force the Russians to fall back. And currently we still don't have, let's say, 100% proofs or, let's say, real information confirming the current status or giving us updates about the current status of the high-rise building that located on the eastern part. Because yesterday the Russians shown us the video how they captured this territory, and today we got additional video of how the Russians were bombing the same area with TOS flamethrower systems. Maybe the Russian launch offensive after these strikes, maybe before, we don't know for sure, but for now it's very difficult to understand, because some Ukrainian sources are saying and the Russians are saying that the situation is very difficult and the Russians were forced to fall back from some directions that they managed to capture yesterday and the day before yesterday and the previous days. If you ask my opinion, I have one important question. I can't give an answer to one important situation that can give us, let's say, understanding of the current situation in Canal. Currently, I don't know for sure, and we have no geolocations and no videos telling us about the status of this part of Chasiv Yar direction. So this is very important positions. This is the western part of Stupki-Golubkovsky forest, and this is a very powerful stronghold, very powerful defense belt. This area is located on the hill, and the Ukrainians from these positions could destroy any Russian offensive operation from the southern part of the eastern Chasiv Yar. So the distance, for example, if the Ukrainians were there, if the Ukrainians were along these trenches, so the distance from edge Ukraine positions and the Russian tank that was attacking the buildings in the eastern Chasiv Yar is less than 600 meters. So it's nothing from the modern, let's say, modern types of anti-tank, let's say, equipment, but for some reason the Ukrainians weren't attacking the Russians. And these things makes me think that most likely there are no Ukrainians along the trenches, and most likely the trenches and the positions along Siversk Donetsk Canal are already under Russian control. Basically, the Russians just can't concentrate forces, the critical mass for further offensive operation, but this is exactly what they're doing right now, and most likely this group is going to move further to the north, trying to cut the Ukrainians from the eastern Chasiv Yar, from the central Chasiv Yar. So this is approximately the situation on this direction. Furthermore, the Russians continue offensive and clearing the situation in the village by the name of Kalinovka, the village that located, let's say, a little bit to the north of Chasiv Yar. There are very heavy clashes in this area as well. The Russians FPV droning the territory, but when talking about the terms and the timings, most likely the Russians are not, let's say, counting on this direction. At least they need another 3 or maybe 4 weeks until they're able to clear this territory completely. Everything, let's say, at the beginning, let's say at the base, there are still a lot of job to do, a lot of fortifications, a lot of buildings, a lot of, let's say, Ukrainian positions, a lot of supply roads that Ukrainians still have for some support, supply rotations and other processes. So it's still a lot of things to do. But anyway, the Russians are pushing. Now we're moving further. We are going to Klishchiivka. We got additional updates from the territory. The Russians intensified their activity in direction of the southwest of Ivanovskaya, and most likely the Russians are about to start another wave of offensive with the purpose to establish complete control over the rich network of the fortifications that located to the northwest of Klishchiivka. We're talking about this area. The Russians published significant number of artillery strikes on the direction. The Russians published significant number of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces. So lots of things, lots of strikes, lots of, let's say, casualties, and the Russians are continue preparation. Because it's very important directions due to the fact that most likely the Russians captured Klishchiivka completely, the part that located in the lowland. According to different sources, there are still Ukrainians that located in the western part, in Klishchiivka, on the hills. And currently the Russians don't have possibilities to attack the Ukrainians from the lowland Klishchiivka to the high-rise Klishchiivka. So that's why the best solution for the Russians is to start moving, let's say, along this line, because if they are able to get here or to establish control over this rich network of the fortifications, then Ukrainians either will be encircled and appear in a cauldron, or will be forced to fall back towards the Ukrainian, let's say, side of Siversk Donetsk Canal. Anyway, the situation continue developing in Russian favor. Now we are moving to Avdiivka direction. We got additional updates, and the most important things are coming from Alexander Alexandropol. According to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture the fields, let's say between the villages by the name of Keramik. So this is significant progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation, a very important achievement, because these attempts, these attacks, this development confirms that most likely the Russians will try to attack, or at least to check, the Ukrainian defense belt and the villages like Alexandropol, in this fortification area, and in New York itself, because during the previous months the Russians were bombing this territory heavily with all types of weapons they have. Lots of explosions, lots of different, let's say, heavy weapons, heavy bombs, and those were, let's say, very powerful and very clear preparation before further offensive. If we compare these strikes with other directions, it reminds me at least Novomikhailivka before the active phase of offensive operation. So most likely the same thing is happening here on this direction. And this is also logical, because the Russians, if they move, if they break through the Ukrainian defense belt on this line, and if the Russians are able to complete the battle for Klishchiivka, East and Chasiv Yar, we see that, we see them common picture of, let's say, global Russian scope of what they're planning to do within the next half year, or at least till the end of 2024. When talking about the western flank, we have additional updates from the Umanska and Nitailova area. According to different sources, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the road between Nitailova and Umanska. This territory is already under the Russian control, and most likely the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from Isnabrodovka very soon, because this is the only settlement left for the Russians to capture on this direction. After that, the Russians will finish the battle for extending their foothold further to the west from Donetsk, Avdiivka to Karlovka water reservoir. So this is the final settlements. After that, the Russians will not be able to move further due to very difficult, let's say, geographical positions. Then they will try to move to the south, to the north, but no longer to the west, or at least to the west but probably from the northern part or from the southern. Krasnogorovka, we haven't received anything, just one video right before start making the video. These FPV drone strikes on Russian positions. So we will discuss these videos in details probably tomorrow. Russian armored vehicle abandoned, some in the fields, and then these tanks were destroyed by the Ukrainian FPV drones. This video confirms that this territory is under Russian control, and most likely this is like the first evidence let's say, of upcoming evidence in the road that the eastern Krasnogorovka has fell, and the Russians currently trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the central and the north, let's say, western part of Krasnogorovka. So just one geolocation from the direction. Now we're moving further to Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka area. We have a lot of updates, and the most important updates are coming as usually from the 79th Air Assault Brigade, who says that the situation is very difficult. And we have, let's say, some correspondence, some pictures from the ground. For example, on this map update from Deep State, we see that the Russians answered Paraskovyevka itself. At least the Russians captured the eastern part. Then we got the video of how the Ukrainians were bombing the possible positions of the armed forces of Russian Federation on this direction. This is very important video because we have 100% confirmation that by the evening of the 19th of May, the Russians have already answered. Most likely during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and most likely tomorrow the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation or some, let's say, forces of 79th Brigade will confirm complete control by the Russians of the area. And the Ukrainians are saying, more precisely the forces of 79th Brigade, that they have lots of problems. They're saying that the Ukrainians reduced the number of munition, weapon that's currently the Ukrainians sent on this direction. The Ukrainians, the reserves and reinforcement that Ukrainian commanders were planning to send to Novomikhailivka months ago were redeployed to Kharkiv direction. So when talking about Konstantinovka, we see that the things develops much faster than, let's say, they used to develop during the battle active phase for Novomikhailivka, which confirms that most likely the Russians will finish the battle for this area much faster than the battle for Novomikhailivka that also took place probably 8 or 9 months since the beginning of the battle. So it was also one of the longest battles ever. So anyway, the Russians continue, and probably the Ukrainians have no forces or resources to stop them. Staromayorska Urozhaina, we have just additional FAPs and artillery strikes. For now, we can stop receiving any updates about further Russian progress. Obviously, there is a Russian progress, but neither Russians nor Ukrainian sources published any information about that. Anyway, we see the significant number of strikes and that Ukrainians continue suffering significant losses in both towns, Staromayorsk and Rozhaina. The Russians also use all types of weapons they have, and as you can see, the Ukrainians have no chances and have no possibilities to show any resistance to the Russian forces. Rabotina area, no changes, just the clashes in the vicinity of the village. Kherson direction, we have important update that according to Russian soldiers, they managed to establish complete control. More precisely, the forces of 76th Division stated today on their official channel that the forces of that division managed to clear Krynky completely, and currently the Ukrainians maybe control just the islands between, let's say, banks of Dnipro River, and this is, according to this division, is the next target of the Russians, to force the Ukrainians to fall back not just from the Krynky but also from the islands. And as you can see, the Ukrainian defense and the Ukrainian resistance completely collapsed after the beginning of Kharkiv offensive. Probably most of the forces, reinforcements and reserves and munition and everything Ukrainians have were retransferred from this direction to the northern one, and the Russians let's say used that opportunity, and we see that the Kharkiv offensive operation probably was the smartest thing ever made by the Russians since the beginning of the special military operation. As soon as the Russians started that offensive, we see that entire line of combat contact, entire Ukrainian defense belt is collapsing every single day, and this process is getting faster and faster. Odessa direction, we have another video of how the Russians managed to discover Ukrainian S-300 system, and as a result of missile strike, that S-300 system was destroyed. Yesterday I reminded that the Russians destroyed IRIS-T system. Now let's move back to Kharkiv, because we started from Bilohorivka and we missed this direction. We have few updates. There are still clashes for Liptsy, probably 6th or 7th day in a row. The sources reported about continuous clashes without any progress from the ground, without any update who is taking, who is controlling the initiative, which confirms that there are very heavy bloody clashes from both sides, either from the Russian, from the Ukrainian. We have additional update from Deep State. The Russians are moving further from Sereda to Zeleno. This is the first confirmation telling us about additional Russian progress on this direction. Volchansk, we still haven't received any updates whether the Russians captured the northern part or not, but the mappers start making first updates about complete control over the territory. We have also the second video with the Russian flag inside of the village, inside of the northern part, but on this video we can see the Russians, as you can see, they're very try to be very careful not to get on the Ukrainian FPV drone strikes or view, so that's why they're making the video with flag, trying to hide somewhere in the vicinity of some basement, and nobody knows exactly where this basement was located. Anyway, this is the first video with the flag, but this is not the video with the flag as we, let's say, saw in Avdiivka during the final battle, during the end of the battle for Volchansk. Anyway, the Russians are pushing. We have more updates about possible the Russian crossing the river, but for now we are keeping almost no changes on the ground. Let's call it like this. The Russians continue hunting and destroying Ukrainian artillery system that Ukrainians are using for counter-artillery duels, and the Russians are pretty successful in this. And once again, if we take a look at the map, you will not see any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Just some FPV drone strikes in the vicinity of Gluboko you can see, and the main strikes are taking place along the main supply road from Pilna to Liptsy, and there are lots of infantry. The Russians still use light infantry for offensives. And the final update is coming from Sumy direction, because on this video we see some people from Sumy published the video of another wave of redeployment of forces in Sumy area, and on this video we can clearly see Abrams tanks and different Western weapon that is heading to the line of combat contact. I can't tell you for sure when exactly the Russians are planning to start Sumy offensive. Maybe tomorrow, maybe after another massive missile strike that is going to take place probably this night. Maybe if the Russians will attack Ukraine 3-4 days, and after that the massive offensive is going to start, and this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense belt most likely. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.